Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
Welcome back, friends. I'm sitting here with Drew Hart, who is the author of a new book called Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. Drew, it's so great to be with you, man. I'm glad you're with us today.
Yes, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Yep.
Oh, man. Yeah. And some folks are familiar with your work. Of course, you had a book prior to this, Trouble I've Seen, and some folks have read that. And now this book came out on the 1st of September, and there's definitely a lot of catch up to do. So folks maybe who don't know about your work and what you're up to, can you give us a little bit of background on your story, maybe a little bit, and then how that led you into academics and also writing and activism and those sorts of things?
Yeah, so I'm, I guess, a Philly boy first and foremost, raised in Philly, in Norristown, Pennsylvania, if anybody knows the area, and eventually ended up going to Messiah College for my undergrad in biblical studies. During that time, really grew a real, I don't know if you should say interest or suffered through some deep questions around racism in the church because of what I was experiencing on campus among some peers. And immediately after that, I was a youth pastor at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church, an urban multicultural Anabaptist congregation here in the city. Did that for about 3.5 years. Also, alongside of that, I was working at an after-school program for middle school boys in the city. And then after that, moved back to Philly. I was an associate pastor at my home church, Black church I grew up in, as well as started my MDiv program, which was a program, MDiv with an urban concentration and a kind of missional theology emphasis over there. After that, I had some professors really who just sparked the idea in my head that I should consider PhD work, which was mind-blowing because I had never even considered anything like that, nor did I think I was PhD material at that time. So I was honored that they really encouraged me and said, no, you really got to consider that. And so I ended up exploring and then taking that turn. And so I went from traditional ministry to studying at Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia. I had a PhD in theology and ethics and a minor in historical theology. And for me, what I was looking at was, I guess the problems were, just thinking about Christendom and colonialism and white supremacy and just the role that Christianity had through all of that. But I was thinking about it in terms of how Black theology and Anabaptism could provide some answers collectively together in response to these historic problems that have mangled the witness of the church. So after that, and actually, while I was there, I should tell this story. So after I finished my coursework, Ferguson had broken out. And at that point, I had already been doing a lot of work with churches around racism in the church. But I was really disappointed and discouraged with the ways that I saw churches responding to the first wave of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I knew I had something to say. And so instead of working on my dissertation right away, I actually turned and wrote Trouble I've Seen first.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't tell my advisor. I didn't tell my committee members, nobody. And I just worked on it. So I was a bad, misbehaving PhD student, but felt called to do what I was doing. And so I did that. And and I was, in fact, it all really worked out really well in terms of me making that decision, but I could have never I didn't know what was coming down the pike. I just felt like I needed to speak into the moment. So did that. Then Messiah College, which was my alma mater, had invited me to come back to teach. And so right after I finished my dissertation and defended it, I started teaching in the fall of 2016 at Messiah, moved back to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And yeah, I've been moving from just doing anti-racism work that I had been doing for so many years. When I moved back here, I began, because I just had a little bit more flexibility in terms of my time. It's interesting that professors, there's a lot of demands on our time, but there's also a kind of flexibility about the job as well. And so I decided that how I wanted to use my flexible time was in community work. Around justice issues that were impacting our community here in Harrisburg, because we have one of the poorest communities between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, are right here in Harrisburg, in the Allison Hill neighborhood where I live. And so just massive issues. And so connecting with faith-based organizers and leaders who are just doing really good work, I along with some other people, started a group called Free Together. And Free Together basically is a relational network of leaders it's ecumenical across different denominations and traditions. But we get people together, we do racial formation work, we encourage justice and racial justice work, and really make it as easy as possible for churches and leaders to get connected with the good work that's happening in our community. And so it's been good work that we've been doing around public education funding, around immigration, around housing, around even now more recently policing is we're collaborating with some folks around that as well. And so, yeah, these are things that I'm very passionate about. And I would love to see the church's witness, strengthened in the public square in a way that is faithful to the vocation of the church, right? And so that really is what led me to even writing the book that I did. And it came at the most timely moment. I had no idea when I was writing what was coming. I tell people I did not know any of this was coming down. The manuscript was done before COVID, and it was certainly done before the second wave of Black Lives Matter movement had sparked up. And so it was just, I guess you could call it a Kairos moment in terms of just how it all fell together.
Sorry. Wow. Yeah, that's wild. I was actually curious about how much of the manuscript was done, and kind of knowing how publishing works, I kind of figured you probably didn't get to do much during pandemic and all of that. It's probably already way into the pipeline, and man, but relevant. I mean, so relevant. And I think it's really, really important. There's a lot we can talk about today. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, and I don't know if you still I think you still use this mantra, right? The Activism you've kind of talked about. Yep. And it sounds like, that's a lot of what your PhD work has done, and also your grassroots stuff and your writing integrates that kind of theme. And I'm curious for listeners who perhaps haven't heard you talk about that. Can you just give a brief sketch of Activism? I think folks can maybe guess there's Anabaptist in there, and there's Black in there, and there's activism in there. So maybe help folks unpack what you mean by that.
Yeah, you just said it. Those are the three core pieces: Anabaptism, Black theology, and activism. And really, it's just a way of describing the weird quirkiness that is me, that I've been deeply shaped by the Black church and Black theology, deeply shaped by Anabaptist communities and Anabaptist discourse, and as well as have tried to live that out in the public square and to bear witness to who God is in the public square. And so all of that kind of comes together. And in many ways, it invites, at least for me, I see it as an opportunity to really dig into radical discipleship to Jesus, a prophetic witness, and literally just, how do we participate in God's overcoming evil with good,
Oh, yeah. That's good.
And so those are just ways that I try to live that out and name it, and naming the specific traditions, that have really informed and helped me see Jesus more clearly. And I think that's my fun way of doing it, is by calling it Activism. And what's been neat for me is that, as quirky as it is, it's neat to see how many people have also been influenced by those two streams, or sometimes it's other ones, but similar. And I can have fun conversations with others about it as well. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. Thanks for breaking that down for us. And I've definitely just appreciated your unpacking of that over the years. And, one of the things that stands out to me as, I'm a historic Anabaptist. My foremothers and fathers, came here in the dark of night to flee in Prussia or whatever. Right. So, and it is thoroughly a white European sort of movement at its foundation, as I understand, at least. And what I think has been missed, a lot of things have been missed in the tradition, I would say, but certainly as Mennonite peoples of various sorts became more and more acclimated to privilege and all of the things that came with that, we have missed a critical voice in the Black church, the marginalized, et cetera. And so I just really appreciate that about your approach. Has that been part of your own sort of, you said you grew up in the Black church, you ended up in an Anabaptist community. What was that sort of whiplash like? And then what was the sort of fusion like, if that makes sense?
Yeah. What is interesting for me is all right. So I should say my very first introduction to Anabaptism was at Messiah College because I was a biblical studies major there. And so I was in the department, and Messiah was founded by the Brethren in Christ. It's not officially a Brethren in Christ school anymore, but it still is influenced in this. So we'll talk about our Anabaptist Pietist Wesleyan roots, right, at Messiah. And certainly in the departments, very much so, a very Anabaptist. And even right today, like we have Mennonites, we have someone who's Brethren, we have BIC, we have a Quaker who's not officially Anabaptist, but, and then you got me as well. Yeah. So, we've got really, it's like an all Anabaptist kind of space there in a unique way that I think is pretty cool. And so for me, I got introduced to it on a subtle level, just in the classroom as a biblical studies major, just getting introduced to themes and stuff like that. I certainly did not consider myself an Anabaptist when I went through the program. I just, was introduced to them. I was wrestling with the questions, but I wouldn't have called myself an Anabaptist. And then my last semester, Pastor Woody Dalton, who was the pastor at Harrisburg Brethren in Christ Church, reached out to me precisely because he was looking for African-American pastor to join the staff because it was a church in the city. It was a historically white Brethren in Christ church that was in a predominantly Black community now because the community had changed over. And so they were trying to intentionally engage race in the church as a part of their ministry. And so that was my first entry, was in this context where that was, at least in theory, them trying to work that out. And so there were ways in which it was a good space for me to kind of be me. And also there was tension there still because they were still working it out, They were just getting all along the way. So there were scars there as well. But it was, But that was already, for me, Anabaptism initially, in terms of actual community, was already multiracial from its start. And then when I moved back to Philly, I tell people Philly's the best place to be an Anabaptist in the world. Like, it's just an awesome place to be an Anabaptist because you got like second and third generation Black Mennonites there. You got Latino Mennonites, you got Asian Mennonites and stuff. You got this really diverse. You have the historic church, like historic Germantown Mennonite and historic Church of the Brethren and all this. It's just an interesting space. But what is neat is that many of the Anabaptists collaborate even across denominations. And so there's something called Kingdom Builders. And so they'll have a monthly meeting for urban Anabaptists in the city. And they meet once a month, and you sit around the table, and it's Black Anabaptists, brown Anabaptists, Asian Anabaptists, and white Anabaptists, right? And so before I got really situated and comfortable with like engaging and speaking to white Anabaptists, my norm was always multiracial Anabaptism. That was like, that's all I knew. And so then when I began to eventually start speaking and engaging other Anabaptists, and I could tell that there was like the sense in which they thought they owned the tradition. So I would always tease them. I say, oh, I guess you're Anabaptist too, because I'm used to like a multiracial space where that's what Anabaptism looks like. I guess you guys count too, So it's kind of teasing a little bit. So I think for me, in terms of communities, my formative experiences of Anabaptist community were always multiracial. So even the church I'm at now, I'm at a It's a Harrisburg Church of the Brethren. It's a Black female pastor. She's probably going to be retiring soon. In the heart, in the hood of Allison Hill in our community, multiracial, incorporating music and traditions and all of that blends all of these traditions together. And so like, I make sense in that space, and I know like I'm a little spoiled having bounced back between Philly and Harrisburg, because there are so many of these kind of communities where I know like that doesn't exist everywhere. It's not all exclusive to Pennsylvania, but because of how long Anabaptism has been around in the city and the large African-American communities here, there's just a richer kind of tradition to draw on and community. And so I've been inspired by all kinds, especially Black Mennonites in particular, that have been really good friends and I've been able to pick their brain and learn from, and vice versa.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's what a cool context to be living in and doing ministry and activism in. It's it's very, very refreshing actually to hear about the diversity and the good work you guys are doing together. And it's really fun to track your journey because I read Trouble I've Seen several years ago now. And I remember like part of your journey included, and correct me if I'm framing this poorly, because I don't want to do that accidentally. But like my sense was, at Messiah, you had some really, really challenging and racist experiences from others. And I just find it so fascinating that you've kind of come full circle and now are an educator in that space. And so I'd love to hear a bit of just background on Trouble I've Seen and some of the stuff you walk through, including your experience in school and how that shaped it. And then if you don't mind, I'd love to hear whatever you're comfortable sharing about just how the transition back into that space kind of has been in any way that feels appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. No. It's even still to today, even while I'm at Messiah, I will always say I have a love-hate relationship with Messiah, right? Which is an interesting thing for me to say. But and that began from the very beginning. I mean, because two powerful things happened when I was an undergrad student. One was I was interacting with, and it's not all my peers, just to be clear, like obviously not all of my peers, but over and over again, I was overwhelmed with the amount of racism that I was experiencing among Christian peers, white Christian peers. And it was, some would, refer to Black students as thugs and all these coded words and stuff like that. And these were supposed to be brothers and sisters in Christ. And so, that really disoriented me, because when I came, I was naive. Like I joke that, my Black church did not prepare me for white Christian community, because I thought it was just gonna be like, oh, my brothers and sisters in Christ, we're gonna have this wonderful moment. And I didn't realize the degree to which how significant racism had still plagued so many Christians' lives and perceptions and biases. And so that threw me off. But at the same time, as I mentioned already, I was a biblical studies major, and we have a dynamic department. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And so we were literally, in some ways, like I'm grappling with what I'm experiencing, and then seeing like, getting into these texts, doing deeper readings on scripture, thinking about Jesus's, witness to the least and last and lost of society, the implications for Jews and Gentiles in the text, the prophets and the commitments to justice, all these kind of things are just hitting me in new ways. I'm reading theology texts and religious texts on like the myths America lives by and stuff, which gets in around like, all kinds of just really powerful stuff that is, forcing me to ask really good questions that are in some ways helping me think about the experiences I'm having. And so there's two competing experiences I'm having on campus in meaningful ways. And so there are things that I deeply treasure about my time that honestly, I don't think I would be doing what I did if it wasn't for the being a part of that department and what I learned through it. But also, in some ways, actually, I could almost say the same thing. I probably wouldn't be doing what I was doing if I hadn't been scarred also by some of my peers who had these biases and were engaging in forms of racism that were civil in some ways, right? And so they're not like, no one's calling me the N-word or anything like that.
Right.
But nonetheless, the microaggressions that were just constantly a part of one's experience, that by the end of it, I mean, you tally up little things over and over and over again. And it's a kind of racial abuse in some ways that someone experiences at the traumatic level. And so I literally needed a break when I moved into Harrisburg afterwards, I was just like, oh, just thankful just to be around Black people where I could just be me and no one's like projecting their stuff onto me, you know? So
of course,
when I loop all the way back around, I had always stayed in contact with a variety of people and faculty and stuff at Messiah. And so when they heard that I was finishing up my dissertation, Messiah actually pursued me, right? And the funny thing is, they knew, I mean, it was well known that I had written about my experience.
Yeah,
so you could have thought they would have wanted to distance themselves from me, but they actually pursued me. And so I didn't even go through a normal hiring process. They actually pursued me, and I just, went through the normal, I wasn't competing against anybody because they really wanted me. And so it felt good to be wanted. And I actually had an opportunity to go a couple other places. I had a few other job offers, which I was just grateful for because theology positions are hard to come by. But in that process, one of the things I realized was, number one, a lot of schools are dealing with this stuff. This is not unique.
Sure.
What I was dealing with is just more a symptom of the broader issues in our society and not something unique to our institution. And so I think that was one of the things that was helpful, and that our institution, as far as institutions go, we're trying to respond. And so there were some institutional things happening with some intentionality in response to it. And certainly at that time when I was a student, I think there could have been more. I think there is even more now than there was back then, along with new hires and stuff that have continued to just enhance who the school is. So when I came back, one of the things I said was, there's something nice about knowing the skeletons in this closet, right? Versus trying to figure it out as I go.
Totally.
But also that I have support. I have the support from the presidents. I have support from my colleagues, and that there's a growing faculty with greater awareness and commitment to racial justice and inclusivity, and making Messiah a really great experience for students of color. We're not there yet, so I'm not going to pretend like we've arrived and we're kumbayaing now. That's not true, right? But I do think that we're as far as Christian colleges go, we're certainly leading in terms of taking some risks that probably a lot of other Christian colleges are unwilling to do.
Yeah. And even, especially in a context like yours, at least the college, right, is in a rural setting. It's historically a white kind of population. And, I've been there, and to be kind of really leading some of these conversations, I think is just really inspiring. And of course, there's plenty of work to be done. And I've kind of noticed, that you kind of brought one thing to my mind earlier. Actually, you talk about how the biblical studies department was always solid, and I've noticed that so my experience. I went to Fresno Pacific, and that's true there as well. That even though culturally it's fairly conservative and whitewashed and all of that, the Bib Studies department as a whole, there tends to be real sort of academic rigor and a commitment to justice and peacemaking and all of these things. And so, so I find a lot of hope in that. But there's still plenty of work to be done. And that's why I'm so happy that not only are you teaching and shaping students, but you're writing to the church. And I think that's a huge gift, man. So thank you for that.
Yeah, for me, that's been, it's interesting because as an academic, a lot of people don't, look highly upon that kind of work, writing to the church, because most academics write to other academics. But I think that, and some of it probably is the fact, maybe some of it's the Anabaptist piece and all, but also just that I was pastoring before, it has shaped my own sense of vocation. and I haven't lost sight of the church, and why.
Yeah.
So I consider myself, sometimes I'll use the phrase public theologian, but I always say, first and foremost, I'm a church theologian, then I'm a public theologian after that. Yeah.
Love that. That's awesome, man. Well, we haven't even stepped into your new book, Who Will Be a Witness? And I was wondering if you could give us an intro to sort of what brought this about. Like your first book, very successful and very helpful and provoked important conversations. I mean, it's still doing that. It's still kind of in the rotation. I feel like I saw something recently, some book club or something at a church or something online. And it's like, oh, and we're having this book club around Trouble I've Seen. I'm like, oh yeah, good. That's
tons
good.
Of them. I mean, it's kind of wild that recently, it's just like, you'd have thought it just launched. I mean, just recently, it's just been blowing up. I've been zooming in with all kinds of church groups and stuff, doing all kinds of stuff. So it's kind of neat to see it kind of almost like it's launching again, just the amount of attention that it's getting right now. But the story, in some ways, they're connected, the two stories for why. So I was going around the country speaking to churches and groups and stuff around anti-racism and discipleship and these things. And towards the end, I got great response. People were extremely positive in response to it. They found it very helpful and challenging, naming white supremacy and Christianity and thinking about racism from a systemic standpoint. All of that was great. But the one question that often came up was, all right, so it seems like you want us to engage in doing racial justice as one of the ways that we ought to go forward. And we have no idea what that means or looks like. Like, what does it mean for us as a church to do racial justice, And after I heard that more than once, I was like, this seems like there's some need here, right? Because I was doing that kind of stuff, and that was really my heart. Even Free Together was about, how do we get the church engaged? And how do we do this in a way that is conducive and faithful for the church? And so these were things that I was really passionate about. So that was the impetus for me writing, was let me help the church think practically about justice work. And then, of course, I can't help myself but do so much more than that in the actuality. And so I ended up thinking about, like, what do I really want to say? And so some of it was thinking about the problems, right? That some of the issues that we have to grapple with is the diluted and domesticated vision of Jesus that is just so prevalent in society. That Jesus looks nothing like the Jesus of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I think that that's an issue that I knew I already cared deeply about, but I was like, this has got to be really important, especially when we're thinking about our public witness in the world. We've got to think through this. I knew that we had to grapple with our mangled witness, because it seems like sometimes in the church, we're the least to recognize how terrible our reputation is in the public square.
Agreed.
In fact, I think you would know Rodney Thomas. I'm not sure if you remember him. Rodney. So he has this great analogy. I've been giving him credit, so I don't steal it from him. He talks about Spider-Man 3 with Tobey Maguire, where there's this scene where Tobey Maguire, he gets Venom gets on him and stuff, and so he's got like this attitude all of a sudden. He's walking down the street and he's kind of like dancing and grooving and pointing and stuff.
Where he looks all emo, right? Doesn't he look all emo or something? Exactly. Like totally off. Yep. But everybody else is like looking at him like weird, like, ew, like what's wrong with this guy? And he's like, thinks he's the hottest stuff in the world. And he kind of compared that to, like, just the triumphalism in the church and how we see ourselves versus how the rest of the world sees ourselves. And I think that's just so helpful, because I think we're the only ones that don't recognize how distorted and diseased our legacy is for centuries, nonetheless more recently, right? And so we've got to grapple with that. But then also what does it mean to be followers of the nonviolent Messiah as we think about strategies that are conducive for the church to do its work? And so I care about, sometimes there's a debate in Anabaptist circles with others in terms of faithfulness versus effectiveness. And for me, like, I do care about effectiveness, so I don't want to leave it off the table, but I also want faithfulness to be on the table and not lost sight of. And so where's the marriage between faithfulness and effectiveness in terms of doing justice work at the grassroots level? And so these were some of the things that I was thinking about. And so I spent a good portion around radical discipleship to Jesus.
I look at the history of Christendom and white supremacy, colonialism, and how that has shaped us. I look at religious nationalism, but also how the prophetic witness of the Black church has spoken back to that. I look at the inner life of the church in terms of power dynamics and our welcoming, because I feel like it's easy for us to think about, we want the society to be just when we're not willing to be just in our own lives. And so we have to have a faithful counter witness in the world as the church, right? In terms of our own lives, what we embody in the world. I have a chapter on worship and justice and the relationship to one another. And then I get more practical into what probably people are looking for, which is thinking about nonviolence theory, thinking about community organizing, thinking about movement theory. I even wade into the ugly waters of electoral politics and think about how can we think about it in a different way than we traditionally have, so that the tail isn't wagging the dog in our ethics. And then I end just with a really hard challenge around love and what it means to love our neighbors the way that God would desire us to. And so, that's really just the kind of scope of what I was trying to do throughout the book, and what I believe will be really helpful for churches to really have both a renewed theological imagination, a Jesus-shaped imagination around who we're called to be, but then also some very practical directions. They don't tell anybody you must do this or that, but just kind of opening up some lanes of possibilities for congregations to think through. Yeah, no,
I'm really excited about that whole scope, man. I mean, this book is a tad longer than your first one, but it's because you really take a deep dive. I mean, you're really hitting core issues, and it's very readable. It flows really well, but you're not holding back when it comes to saying we've got to really go deep on these things. And I appreciate that about the feel of the book, and yet it's so pastoral and so practical in the sense of you're pointing people a direction. And I think that's really, really helpful. And one of the things that early in the book, I mean, you bring up your introduction is very robust, but early in the book, you bring up, and I'll read one line. It says, "Silence on the challenges of our day is not courageous." And that's a tweetable line, man. That's powerful stuff. And behind that is you've been having, you have this conversation about, Democrats, Republicans, left, right. And then those churches that kind of look like one or the other. And then those churches, which is a lot of them, at least I think in evangelical land and, just throughout the country, that are halfsies, right? They're these sort of we're going to make sure that, yes, we acknowledge there's some stuff here and there's some stuff here, but it's really almost a passivity to really be willing to say, no, this is wrong. This is immoral. This is unjust. And so talk to us about that, because I know during political season, the conversations are going to keep going. Yeah, the truth is somewhere in the middle, like you bring up. Right, and the truth is, there's this tension because, as an Anabaptist, there's that whole I don't pledge allegiance to the flag. I'm not pro Caesar. Right. I'm not going to align. Right. And so on the other hand, it's, if I don't use whatever power or privilege I have with my neighbor in mind, especially my neighbor who maybe has less of those things than I do, I'm missing an opportunity. So can you unpack some of that and some of what you've noticed?
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you already pointed to number one, how do we break out of being captive to the partisan, the just corrosive partisan politics of our society, right? So much of the church, it's easy, as I say, you walk into a church, it doesn't take very long to know, oh, these are Republican Christians or these are Democrat Christians, and so there's the captivity to partisan politics so deeply impacts so many Christians that we have to begin there, right? The degree to which we just fall in line. So literally the platforms of elites gets packaged and then handed to us, and we just accept it as is, right? Without a Jesus-shaped imagination for how to engage in our society and how to respond to the issues of our society. And so whether it's, the single issue voting or this or that or whatever, we're just in the pockets of powerful people. And really the story of Israel and fulfilled and culminated in the person of Jesus Christ seems to have nothing in shaping our imagination for how to live and how to be in this world. And so that's just the starting point, I think, is that we have to grapple with that. But then there is that danger that people want to then try to be balanced, right? That's their imaginations. Well, the answer to this is, I'm going to be neither Republican nor Democrat. I'm going to be somewhere in the middle because, as you said, truth lies somewhere in the middle. And it sounds nice. It sounds great at first, but then you only got to think for a moment and think about, like, what does this mean when we're actually talking about actual people's lives and real serious issues? And the best answer that we have is that we're going to meet in the middle, that we're going to go halvesies on really serious problems. This is deeply problematic. And so you think about it outside of our own context and you plug us into another moment like the Holocaust or something. No one would say that's being faithful to go halvesies in the midst of the Holocaust, right? It's the apartheid system in South Africa. We don't want to be moderates in that situation, right? And so the real question is, well, what is righteous? What is good? What is God calling us to? And how do we take a stand and join in with what God is doing in the world, what God desires from us? These are much harder things to grapple with because our minds can't be captive to the logics of mainstream society if we're going to answer that question. And so, I think that we're going to need a little bit more of a courageous Christianity that's willing to leap out in the way of Jesus. Seek him, though, right? Not just, it's easy to just plaster Jesus' name to whatever we believe. We've got enough of that already. We don't need any more of that. But what does it mean to actually bathe ourselves in the story of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, hear and then seek after the living spirit of Jesus in the world that aligns with that, and participate and join in with what God is doing? I think those are completely different things. And that's where, all of a sudden you have abolitionists in slavery and confessing church, or even more radical than the confessing church in Germany and other things where people are willing to take a risk in the way of Jesus because they can call sin, right? And it's not just a personal piety issue, but social sin, communal sin, intergenerational sin, systemic sin. We can talk about those things as well. And we can believe that God's deliverance is just as thick and as broad and as holistic and comprehensive as the sin that we see in our world.
Oh, man, that's beautiful. Yes, that's so good. And I appreciate you just kind of painting that picture, because that is what I think a lot of us are desiring, right? We want the church to be that. And yet there's a lot of forces that are pushing against that. And most of them are Christian-based forces, unfortunately. And so we've got some work to do. But I really appreciate you breaking that down. And it makes me want to talk about something you mentioned earlier, actually. You talk about, at the end of your book, towards the back end, you have a whole section where you break down the things that make for peace. And you're talking about the various philosophies of protest and these sorts of things. And one of the things that I think comes up, and you're probably constantly facing this question, so feel free to opt out even if you need to opt out, because, man, this is something that I'm sure is thrown around a lot. But the second wave of Black Lives Matter has been very interesting for me to notice how different people, white people particularly, respond to the protests. And, some have become violent and whatnot, maybe to an extent or too much. But my point being, a lot of what I'm seeing is sort of this sort of like messy middle or nothing at all sort of approach, where they'll take the Black Lives Matter sort of, I don't know what the word is, but sort of their like mission statement, and they'll say, but clearly they lean towards gay marriage. Clearly they lean towards pro-choice, and they'll say, therefore, we're not going to accept any of this. Black Lives Matter is bad. And as Christians, it feels like we have to step into the messy waters of, saying, what, there's a lot of things that need to be, talked about and processed, but there are a lot of things that are very clear that a movement like this is representing that Christians could endorse and probably should come alongside and under the leadership of in some ways, And so I'm just curious about some of that paired with, of course, the question of violence and what are some things that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. So let's jump back in time for a little bit and plant ourselves in like the 60s, right?
Yeah.
And you think about the freedom movement of the civil rights movement was actually happening on the ground versus what we remember about it. In fact, you think about what was happening in the accusations against King, right? I mean, number one, they're calling him a communist, right?
Yeah.
And people are actually using that as an excuse to not participate in the civil rights movement, right? We can't because he's a communist, right?
Yeah.
Or he's associated with some communists, and so therefore we can't participate in what's happening. So there's always these blanket statements and accusations rather than dealing with number one, it's a lazy categorization of someone rather than actually dealing with actual ideas. But nonetheless, to say there was no singular idea that was happening at that time. And I think it is fair to say King was a democratic socialist. He wasn't a communist, but he was a democratic socialist. But he did associate with a whole wide range of people, right? And so if you were going to be involved in the movement, you would be collaborating with people that you agreed with and that you disagreed with. And that was always the case. The abolitionist movements, right? There were people who disagreed on a whole range of stuff. You have some abolitionists who, I'm talking about for slavery, who like wanted Black people to go back to, Africa afterwards. You had some who were still basically racist, but wanted to end it because that's all they could understand. And then you had some more radical, especially in white abolitionists who actually were truly egalitarian in their vision, right? They didn't always agree and yet they were all a part of an abolitionist move. They didn't say, oh, well, that person believes differently than me, so I'm not going to get involved. That would just be silly, right? You think about King. I mean, when he came to Birmingham, they called him an outside agitator, right? That was he needs to, don't participate in it. He's an outside agitator. And they try to dismiss the movement because he's stirring up too much trouble here, right? And everywhere he goes, there's a riot coming, So you think about just these ways in which people try to find reasons to not get engaged in the past. All we're seeing is the exact same thing with just new language. And so I think that anybody that's actually about social change work in their communities understands that you partner and you collaborate with folks even who across difference. And that's and that may mean that sometimes there's things that you may not engage in. That's fine. But to just completely opt out of the justice work altogether and to do nothing because somebody has a slightly different philosophy than you. I mean, that is very silly, I think. And so I think that it more exposes, I think, the lack of real commitment for loving our neighbors and willing to actually care about their well-being more than it is about the specific terms that people are. So like right now, people are throwing out, Marxism or critical race theory and stuff. They don't even know what they're talking about. I think most of the people who throw those terms around, I can guarantee you that 99% of them have never read Marx and they've never read any critical race theory, but they want to throw these terms around because they heard some pundit throw it around and now that's the thing to do. And so I think that that's lazy work. And I think that we can do better. I think that kind of way is not demonstrating the kind of love that we're supposed to be known as the church. And certainly doesn't represent the kind of commitments we ought to have for the least and last and lost of our society. Literally, people are suffering right now. People are hurting. And when we're thinking about the violence that happens, the cycles of violence that are going on in our streets and the devastation that it actually causes real families, and then it's an embarrassment to that once again we're having these really silly conversations on the side.
Wow. That's so helpful. I think a lot of people are going to hear that and receive that. I hope they do. Because that's the side stuff. Look, as Christians, anytime we step in, if I'm hearing you right, anytime we step into a secular political sphere of any kind, it's going to be very hard for us as Jesus people to endorse every single nuance of every single position of every single thing that someone holds, but they may be doing something that perfectly aligns with God's desire for humankind. Like, finding justice and liberation for folks who are at the margins of society. I mean, that to me sounds like Jesus. And so, it's messy. And I think and I would guess, and without putting these words in your mouth, but part of the kind of courage you were talking about in the book is this courage to actually enter those messy space, that what feels like messy space, perhaps, and actually say, no, at the end of the day, I've got to give all that I can to justice and shalom, and be okay with the nuances that maybe I still have to hold in tension. Would you kind of say that? Yeah.
Yeah, think about the Jesus story. Like, Jesus literally is walking with tax collectors and zealots, right?
Yeah.
And that's his crew. And when he gets arrested, I talk about in the Liberating Barabbas chapter, like, the disciples, they're ready to fight, right? They thought that was the deal all along. So that's who Jesus has. He has violent folks along, even as he is committed to peacemaking, right? And so, like, that's how, if Jesus can do that, then why can't we? Why can't we?
Yeah.
We don't have to compromise our own ethics in it. We bear witness by our lives, by what we're going to do, but doesn't mean that we can't collaborate at points of commonality and common interest in ways that actually can build the common good for our communities, especially for those who are most vulnerable in our communities.
Yeah. Oh man, that's so helpful, man. And and it's really important. Like, so I've been encouraged to a point. I mean, not as encouraged as I wish I could be. And I'm sure that's, 1,000-fold for you. Like I've been encouraged by like a lot of my friends that I grew up with. There's this pocket of them that all of a sudden are actually looking at like racial injustice with honest eyes. And these are very conservative people. And I had an exchange with one of my friends who is, very conservative. and he's just like, I can't like believe that I've been blind to this my whole life. I can't believe that this is not talked about. This feels like something that God would care about, and so I've been encouraged by those sort of micro pockets of conversation and hoping that they catalyze into something more. And I think a resource like yours is, one of those that can come alongside a journey like that. And, on the other end, I've been very, there's a lot of just struggle, I think, for folks when they see the worst of the worst of protest. And of course, the media is setting us up for a lot of that. But when I say the worst of the worst, like actual like brawls and violence and, those sorts of things, which are rare. Yeah. I mean, by comparison, they're actually quite rare. Right. But I followed a feed, and was watching one of the protests here in Seattle, and even things like going by the precinct and throwing rocks at windows and stuff to sort of let the rage out, which totally justifiable rage. I'm holding that with a lot of like openness, but I think of those folks who really just use those things as justification to say, this was just a bunch of liberal, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to listen to my one particular black friend or my one particular black voice that says Trump's basically got this under control or whatever. And so as Jesus people called to peace, but also called to wise collaboration and stewardship of influence, how do we step into that kind of reality?
Yeah, well, number one, I think there's a lot of things that we got to think about when we enter into that. Number one, I love that they just came out with that research around the Black Lives Matter movement that they found that I think it was like 93% of all protests have been nonviolent and peaceful, right?
Oh, man. Yeah.
And that included, like, they were including violence as like bringing down statues of Confederate. I mean, it was a whole range of things that, like, I actually don't have a problem with that. I know some people will. But for me, like, I don't consider that violence. I think that the statue itself is a form of cultural violence that assaults the dignity of Black people. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
No, I'm with you. Yeah.
But even taking their definition as it is, 93%. So overwhelmingly, and I've said that to people, like, look, I've been at multiple. I've never actually been at a Black Lives Matter movement that was violent. So that's intriguing, the perception versus the reality. But yeah, there's no question that there are some that sometimes, and certainly in certain regions, and that's part of that's how movements work, is based on whoever is in leadership in any given place. There is no one like unified strategy or approach. It's always a plethora because it's a movement. It's not, people act like it's just this one big organization. No, it's actually a lot of different organizations. And some of them are actually Christians that are leading the Black Lives Matter movements in their communities. So it really varies. So one of the things we ought to think of is what happens when we aren't at the table to kind of give input into strategies and how we want to go about this work. Because if we're really committed to it, then we can actually help steer it in actually more nonviolent ways rather than in violent ways. So actually not showing up actually could be a detriment if you're really concerned about it becoming violent. Secondly, I think that, again, going back to King, it was interesting that King, nobody was more committed to nonviolence than Dr. King. Yeah. And yet when people brought up issues around violence and rioting, he says that, the riot is the language of the unheard, right? So he wanted to sympathize with those who were doing it and why they're doing it, because people had ignored their concerns for so long. Of course, when the formal channels aren't working, people go through other channels, right? Yeah. So we've got to understand, why would people go to these radical extremes? Well, the fact of the matter is that in the Black Lives Matter movement, the concerns around police brutality are not new. In fact, if you go back all the way through the early 20th century, almost the majority of times where Black people have rioted has been because of police brutality for like a century. Like, this is actually a very consistent theme that we've seen for a very long time. It's not new. It's not the media that's doing this. This is a long ongoing problem in the way that it's been responded to. And so then the other thing that I'd say is, for me, which is why I do want to show up at the table, is because social science actually suggests that nonviolent movements are actually more effective than violent ones, right? Yes. And so I want to be able to, along with me preaching the ethics of Jesus, I want to tell my non-Christian friends, look, you don't have to buy into this in terms of just the ethics of it, but just alone, like, I believe that this way is a better way. And the social science actually backs it up, that it's actually twice as effective and growing in effectiveness. And violent movements are actually decreasing in effectiveness every year. And both of those are true in both under democracies and under dictators, right? Wow. And so there's something powerful about a nonviolent way that people have to grapple with outside of just faith, right? And so I can come into any circle and turn and argue around effectiveness, not just around faithfulness. So while in the church, I'm inviting us to commit our whole lives to the peacemaking of Jesus. Well, when I'm working with others, I can strategize and say, look, let's be strategic here. Violence tends to actually sometimes do the exact opposite of what we're hoping to accomplish. While nonviolence has a way to win people over in a way that violent action doesn't. And so I think that there's a kind of a neat way in which we can give an approximation of our ethic to people who don't necessarily share in our faith. And so anyway, these are just opportunities. But if we are refusing to show up, if we don't want to get messy, then we can never have any influence. And in that way, we're actually allowing the cycle of violence to be more likely to continue on rather than breaking the cycle. I think followers of Jesus should be committed however we can to breaking the cycles of violence by bearing witness to Jesus's peacemaking. And that will involve all kinds of conversations and connections and relationships. And for me, like, let's say I was at something and all of a sudden, people wanted to like raise arms and start shooting. Obviously, I'm not going to participate in that, right? Right. So right. So it's not like our collaboration means that you have to do everything that they're going to do. But hopefully it's the opposite, that I can invite them into something that I believe will actually produce shalom. I mean, that's why I love the language of the things that make for peace. What are those things that Jesus talks about? What are the practices in our lives that actually do bring more shalom in the world? And it's not something that only Christians can learn from. Anybody can learn from these things. And so we have a gift to share.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. That's so good. That's so helpful. And, as we kind of move towards a close, I wanted to pick your brain about one more thing, because your book comes at such an important time, I think, in our history and the struggles that are being raised to public awareness in a new way. And one of the big topics, again, one of these silly media screwed up topic points is policing. And, this idea of, I have a book. I haven't had a chance to dip into it yet, but I have a book called The End of Policing, right? And there's,
I've read it. Yeah.
Yeah. And there's defund the police is kind of this hashtag and philosophy and all of these things going on. And I'm curious, like what is that getting at? Is that, from your perspective, do you find some real, what's the right word? Do you find the idea of defunding police, as you understand it, as something that could really be liberating for communities, especially BIPOC communities throughout the country and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have to, and some of this, the challenge, I think, in terms of some of these conversations is that we're having these conversations ahistorically. So we're not placing like what has happened over the last several decades. So like, in the 70s, the funds for policing were significantly lower than what they were. And they have grown proportionally as the war on drugs has grown and mass incarceration has grown. So has grown the funding of police. And policing, what all that has led to has not decreased poverty in the most vulnerable communities. It has not decreased violence in the most, it has not decreased drug addiction. It has not decreased, in fact, has not increased well-being or safety. No one's like, oh, now that the police are driving by, I feel a lot safer. In fact, it's usually, and certainly in my community, people feel more threatened when they see the police driving by because they don't know if they're going to be harassed, if they're going to be humiliated, if they're going to be brutalized. And I'm not just talking about getting shot in the back like we see on TV. But what people don't see is the everyday little things, the little humiliations that happen all the time. I've witnessed my own neighbors, like what happened to George Floyd when I was in Philly. Like I remember, that's why I didn't actually watch the video. I saw the first couple seconds and I stopped because it looked just like what happened to one of my neighbors. He didn't die, but he was arrested. He was handcuffed. And the police officer had his knee into his neck and was shoving his face into the pavement. He wasn't resisting, but it was just brutality for brutality's sake, just to show his dominance, Wow. And so when I saw the video, I already knew what happened, so I didn't need to see any more. But it reminded me of these everyday kind of interactions. And so something is terribly wrong with our policing right now. And it's not promoting well-being. It's not promoting safety. And so if that's what we say the mission is, and it's not doing that, and it has produced and helped to accelerate mass incarceration in our society, which has always targeted poor Black and brown communities. It has targeted drug addiction. It has targeted the homeless, and has targeted people with mental health challenges. And so the most vulnerable in our communities are disproportionately the ones being thrown into jail. And that's supposed to be our answer. That's the public safety that we have. I'm sorry, something's terribly wrong. So what would it look like, not to erase the idea of some mechanisms for public safety and well-being and accountability to keep people safe, but what does it mean to reimagine them in ways that actually do what we want them to do, right? At least what we claim they're supposed to do. Yeah. What would it be to fund, for example, we know a lot of petty crime is because of poverty and drug addiction. That's just huge. In my community, if you solve poverty and drug addiction, you would get rid of a lot of petty crime, right? Yeah, absolutely. So what would it look like to actually spend, we spend more money in my city on policing than on education. What would it be to fund education, to fund jobs, to fund healthcare and rehabilitation for drug addicts, right? These kind of things that can produce real well-being for folks, I think we've got to take seriously. It doesn't mean that doesn't mean that it'll be a utopia and there will be no more violence. You're going to have people in place who can respond and intervene in moments of violence. But hopefully we can have people trained better, right? Peacemaking skills, social science, psychology, intervention skills. I think especially sometimes in the poorest neighborhoods, you have the least educated people doing the work when you really need people with even more sensitivity and awareness and strategy and skills to be entering into these sensitive moments so that they're not escalating problems, they're not misreading moments, but really helping to end cycles of violence and suffering. And so I do think that we need to be more courageous in these conversations. I know a lot of people get very scared around languages, around defunding and abolition, all things like that. But the fact of the matter is our system is deeply broken. It's not working. It has not worked. All across our country, especially in poor and Black communities, policing looks very different than it does in suburban communities and middle-class communities across our nation. And we've allowed that, knowingly allowed all kinds of horrific practices to go on. And yes, every now and then, the worst of it explodes into someone getting killed, shot in the back. But it's not even just that issue. It's a much deeper rooted issue that's not responding to the actual needs of people. And so I think we're literally throwing away millions and millions of dollars every year into a system that actually, I would say, produces more violence, not reduces it.
Yeah. Wow. And, the image comes to my mind as I hear you talk of like preventative care, like in health, in general health, right? You want to do all the things you can to take care of like yourself. Like for instance, you brush your teeth every day so you don't get cavities. And if you get cavities, there's someone there to respond to that. If I take care of my body, hopefully I don't get a terminal diseases early or whatever, right? Like there's these preventative things. And it sounds like in a lot of ways, the policing, and this is simplistic because it's way more nuance in this, but in a lot of ways, by analogy, like policing is really that reactive stage of healthcare that, oh, you've got a really bad problem. And so we're going to intervene with drastic measures here. And unfortunately, those drastic measures have produced violence and oppression and all of those sorts of things. And part of the defunding conversation is what are those things we can actually put in place that break the cycles of generational poverty and suffering and violence, which then will have, an effect on the sorts of things that police get called out to and hopefully have a huge ripple effect for good. I wish people really would sit with those dynamics a bit more than just simply say, it's kind of like the military. Of course we give tons of money to the military, and that's a very conservative thing to do. So it's okay to be, giving tons of your tax dollars away over there, but just not for, these social programs that could really make a difference in your neighborhood or whatever. So anyway, I'm just kind of ranting, but that's, man, I really appreciate you breaking that down.
Yeah, I think, and some of it, I wonder to what degree, you think about, and I don't have to tell you, like I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but like a theology of shalom, like we need a theology of shalom so deeply because we can't imagine like what does it take to move towards more wholeness and more healing and more flourishing of humanity. And because we're so punitive in our mindsets around legal systems and law and order and stuff like that, which I think someone did something wrong, so they deserve what's coming to them, right? That kind of mindset, which that ends up just increasing cycles of violence, all kinds of cycles. And so we don't know how to restore people and to participate in God's restorative vision for humanity. And I think that we desperately could use a healthy theology of shalom in our society that I think could orient us in a better direction. And we'd be more willing to make changes when needed if things were broken and not working, because it's not producing what we're actually desiring. Yeah.
Wow. Well, my friend, I think you've painted a big picture, a beautiful picture of what could be, and have also pointed us towards some of the work that needs to happen if we're ever going to move towards what could be. And I just really appreciate both your pastoral heart and your intellectual vigor and how you bring those two things together and step into the streets at the same time. I mean, I just think there's so much there that I admire and appreciate about you. And I'm sure many people listening are going to be intrigued by this conversation. And I want to give you a chance just to point folks towards ways to get in touch with more of your work. Of course, they can buy the book, Who Will Be a Witness? They can buy the book, Trouble I've Seen. How else can they track you down online and beyond?
Yeah, along with those, you can also find me on Twitter and Instagram, DRUHART, and Facebook, of course. You can also find me more recently this past year. I joined my friend Jared McKenna on a podcast, Inverse Podcast.
Yeah.
And Inverse, it's a global conversation because he's from Australia. And so we engage folks around liberative readings of scripture.
That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a different kind of podcast, and we have a lot of fun with that. And actually, we also do periodically book studies with folks all around the world. So like right now, we're doing one on Who Will Be a Witness, and we've got folks from like Norway and South Africa and Kenya and Canada and all over the place. It's a lot of fun.
Wow. Yeah. That's great. That's great. Awesome. Well, Drew, thanks so much for being with us. I'm so glad that we finally got to do this. And as you continue to do good work, man, let us know and, let me know. And we'll be back doing this conversation thing again. I'm really, really excited and hope folks will grab the book and do some hard self-work and also try and say, what does it look like in my church? What does it look like with my friends to step into this with courage? So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.